Good morning, everyone. This is just to double check that you can actually hear correctly the translation into English. Can you please let us know if you are listening to the interpretation into English for this panel? Yes. Please do let us know. Okay, fantastic. So thank you very much for being here with us today. We are going to talk about prevention and organizational resilience. We are all here. You cannot leave the room now that we have seen you. So what will we be talking about? So we live in time of current cumulative crises, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. These are the main words here, the keywords that we'll be utilizing today. So, in general, the question is, how can we navigate those difficult times, because we cannot see through these fog wall, so to speak. So we're going to speak about practical and theoretical aspects of resilience, of adaptation, and we will talk about that, considering how we can actually manage future crises under the aegida of prevention. So the panel includes experts at a scientific level, dealing with the scientific publication that we have already talked about time and again, that you can find on our website. And there are three levels. So the societal one, the local, and the organizational one. That is to say, the one we'll be focusing about today, and the personal one. We have heard that time and again. So if you are interested in that, please do go online and visit our website. So good morning, Dr. Peter Kurz. You are our mayor. I already know that you know about him. You know that the Mannheimer citizens will be voting at the end of this week on the 16th of June. So you have been mayor since 2016, and you're also part of the Global Parliament of Mayors. So thank you very much for being here with us today. Of course, a big round of applause, because we need to hear you in this huge room. And then we'll continue with Jan Philip Maaß-Emden, working at ANTelligence Consulting. So he is also a consultant for different organizational structures for administrations and companies. He also studies neurological phenomena, and he is the author of a number of publications. Actually, I have tried to read those complex texts. Unfortunately, I haven't had the time to do so, but do go ahead and check those publications out. Then we have Vincke from BASF. She is also an expert at international level, dealing with safety. She was also in Afghanistan with the Global Police Project team, with the European Union Border Manager. She was an assistant throughout the mission in Lübingen and in the city of Ludwigshafen. And then she is our expert for geopolitics and crisis management. And then we have Andreas Stenger. Everybody knows him here in Mannheim. He is the president of the police department here in Baden-Württemberg, and she is also president of the office, the regional office for criminal affairs here in Baden-Württemberg. He has been so since 2022. I am Janina Klabes. I am a freelancer moderator, and I am going to ask questions. You can also do so. There are microphones that you can utilize in the room. So we are going to prepare the work together. So organizational resilience. Can you quote three main factors so underpinning this topic? So we can focus on three factors, as you said. So the robustness. So is there anything that has an impact onto me in a way? Then redundancy. Do I have the chance to, and the skills and the capacities to actually face a situation and change something when I'm impacted by events? Or do I have negative expectations in terms of outcomes? And then the third one is elasticity. Can I navigate in a flexible way those situations so that I can find solutions and adapt myself? So these would be the three main factors. So how can we then go about it from our perspective? So when we try and think about it, so let's talk about a condition. So, for example, you have a lot of small pains at a body level, then your resilience is not the best. And then you say, yes, every now and then I feel something, but my immune system can actually utilize all the reserve that I have that are needed to actually go over such conditions. So this would be a resilient body. So let's stick to this metaphor. So prevention and organizational resilience. So let's say, how can we translate that into a company structure? So resilience and prevention go hand in hand. So there are interactions that can be identified. Resilience, do I have the capacities, for example, do I have the chance or the skills to protect myself and to adapt myself? So this is already in a way prevention, because I am able to actually plan some interventions, for example, because I thought about a worst case scenario, what would be or what would happen if. So it's a kind of strong construction, if you will, a construct. So resilience in a company means that we can adapt the company, for instance, so that prevention is actually there to be seen. So there are some negative events impacting the company. So I need to learn something and actually learn the lesson so that we can prepare ourselves for the next crisis. And this is an example of a learning organization that in this virtual circle becomes more and more resilient to actually be prepared for any future events. In companies, maybe we can think that all this is maybe easier so that we can readapt our orientation to actually be able to get to the goal that I have set to myself. So maybe that is not the same at an administrative level. So how do we go about that? We talk about crime and authorities. Now, as I've already said, the company objective is not a subject matter to be discussed. So when the product to be manufactured or the services to be offered are clear, well, we cannot just say, okay, I'll leave the shoe industry to manufacture cars. So we need to stick to that. But the problem is connected to the fact that we live in at times in which we talk about being efficient and optimize. that is the reason why we need to optimize and use to the fullest the resources that we have. So when there are no buffers from this viewpoint, this has an impact onto resilience. That means that we're pushed to the limit quite fast. So the fact that we are stress resistant and stress resilient, if we are not so, we get to the end of the resources available very fast. So this is especially important when we end up in a crisis situation. So when we talk about an organization such as the police, this is of paramount importance. So the capacities and the skills that we have, so we can actually start thinking about it. How do we go about that? Of course, without renouncing the objective of the organization itself. What can help is as having a vision. Where do we want to go? Where are we headed for the future? So this orientation, why are we do that? So we need to talk about the why, as we know, the very heart of our perspective, of our vision. Why are we actually doing what we're doing? So this can help us further develop and optimize resilience. Thank you. And let's move to the practical side of things. The police, our companies and politics. So the importance of resilience. Maybe let's leave the floor to Ms. Vincke. So during the pandemic, we saw that the global immune system can be negatively impacted, not just the individual ones. And we have seen that talking about the climate crisis, and the same goes for the crisis and the war in Ukraine. And so we have already consumed 4% of the gas supplies, for example, and this means that BASF, for instance, as a company, will have to face the consequences of the higher energy prices, as we've heard time and again. So we live in a world that are characterized by the polycrises, as we have defined them. When we talk about crime, of course, there are a number of people impacted by the situation, and I believe that this world is actually strongly volatile from a financial viewpoint, but also from political and a safety-related viewpoint. So what works fine and what doesn't? I don't think that we are actually in the best possible position to learn the lesson from those crises, be that the pandemic or a flight catastrophe, for example. We don't have the time, or we don't take the time to actually go over how we have managed or haven't managed to face this shockwave, if you will. So this is an emergency scenario leading to the next emergency scenario, in which maybe we cannot handle in a preventative way to actually try and master in a way, or the crises that will come up. That's why we need to be more flexible, and we need to react in a better way. So the pandemic taught us how quick we need to react. That goes for the police as well. So I believe that fine, we need to be flexible as we have been so far. What hasn't worked that well is the way we have actually learned the lesson in this reactive mode. And then Dr. Kurz, from a political viewpoint, what worked fine in the city, or are there other aspects that haven't been touched upon yet and that pertain to your side of things? So as you said, yesterday I was here on stage and I said all that was mentioned in terms of managing the pandemic. So there was a totally different dimension of crisis. So what happened, how we managed, and in terms of systems, what lesson did we learn. So there were quite a few phases, 3 years of crisis, determined different phases, as we said, and different challenges that we can go over, correlated to something that, as of now, in Germany, in general, maybe can't be gauged as we should. So we need to redefine clear goals and what means to be successful, what it means to be successful, and how we can assess this, as we said. So this is something that we're not used to. That is the reason why we take for granted, in a way, that everything is clear from a conceptual viewpoint. So we need to come up with a model that can be translated into the reality of things and that can work. So will it work? Fine, but in politics it has always been this way. So 20 years, 20 years of analysis, 20 years that have been studied from a structural viewpoint to actually understand what has been improved, so forth. So in general, this is a big question. So resilience factors that you have mentioned, together with the objectives that we have to set for ourselves, that is actually embodied by the organizations themselves, so that considering everything that has happened since 2007, 2008, can actually put into categories that then can be gauged, so that automatically they can be traced back to predetermined factors, so that we can cooperate in a general way, so that we can work towards strengthening our capabilities, as we said, depending on the different objectives that we have. And of course, we can only get there if we work together with our colleagues. So this goes under the edge of the big topic of culture. So in terms of what contributions were made and can be made to manage the situation in a better way, and then an attitude in the organizations. So how can I put it? So everybody manages part of the organization, be that a smaller or a bigger department. We need to find some common ground as political entrepreneurs. What do I mean by that with this definition? So somebody who is not limited by resources that are readily available at present. So what I can take upon myself, for example, what can I ask for? How can I reorganize the resources that may or not pertain to my resource portfolio? So this is an attitude to manage actually the situation. We need to rethink things in a way, because this is going to help us at times of crisis, so that I can understand whether I do have this mindset or I don't. Do I have the skill or I don't? So based on one of the most important experiences that we've made, so cooperation with people who are outside the organization, so for example the civil society. So this is a type of test, if you will, for a city that has networks and structures that work fine. And let's name, for example, let's go to a practical example. So in Germany, actually the injection rate during the crisis was a bit different in terms of what was done elsewhere. And we are referring here to the vaccination campaign. So we had to rethink about these structures, and we need to take that into account. So where are the facilities? With whom can we talk? Do we want to connect a synapses or not? So this is something that cannot be built from scratch overnight. So this new attitude has well helped us out, but not as much as elsewhere, where local actors already ready were to actually strive for those common goals and do that together, as we said. So we talked about it yesterday as well. So we mentioned the social capital, which of course of paramount importance, that is connected to social resilience and trust as a topic itself. Actually, what glues us together, that makes us stick together? Of course, we had to experience that directly during the pandemic, and we had to draw on our resources, for example, and when you as police officers had a task and you had to take into account the resources available, as we said, and then managing demonstrations, for example. So the fact that at a societal level we can understand each other, we can stick together vis-a-vis the problems connected to the resources. So obviously that entailed a lot of work and a lot of strength, as we said. So considering the topic of resilience from the perspective of an organization, as we said, we need to draw the lessons, and we need to talk about, and we must talk about those topics, and yet again utilize what we have learned so far. So thank you very much. So can you further comment on that? Much has already been said, actually. Yes, actually, you have already mentioned quite a few elements which are essential and crucial. I can only reiterate what you said. So first of all, you mentioned those polycrises. So we get from one crisis into the next, and therefore there was a dynamic change in our context as well, connected to digitalization, for example. So when we take into account organizational aspects, so we are not the same organizations as in the past, that we need to be more agile, more horizontally organized, so that we can take everything into account to make decisions in a quicker way. So at times of crisis, during the pandemic, from my position, I can say that we had to transform ourselves into a different different organization, because the rules were actually too rigid to actually face the volatility of the situation. That is the reason why we needed to be more reactive. That is the reason why we needed to think as if we were entrepreneurs, so that the resources which are needed are readily made available, and that we understand in a better way how we can use them. So we didn't take that upon ourselves. We needed to improvise. We needed to be ready to change, which is obviously a little bit difficult when considered from the viewpoint of the employees, of the staff, which are, or who are, better said, a bit reluctant, because they do perceive in their everyday life, in their routines, such changes which are huge. So this was a process that needed to be managed at best, entailing a communication aspect. So this was a dual way of going about it. For example, So how do we manage this? Do we focus on staying reactive, for example? So the ID controls, for example, as we did that in the past, that wouldn't work anymore, and others um, also talked about the fact that we needed to be present. We can't just close the doors and just hide and work from home in our case. And so in the beginning, we experience a wave of sympathy throughout the lockdown, for example. So actually, I wanted to stick to our core goal. So we didn't want to reach a collapsing of the system as we saw in Italy, for example. So we wanted to actually avoid social gatherings, to avoid having to face worse consequences. So obviously we stayed present, but when then politics came into play to actually create a different type of consensus, because that was actually questions in terms of putting into practice everything that we had decided to do. So how do we do that together with citizens? So we managed to take the matter into our own hands and keep that under control. However, considering the core aspects in a situation such as those ones, we need to have organizations which are agile, that can work in a proactive and anticipatory way, and they need to have some sort of freedom to actually access the resources that are needed, and we need to manage at best the managerial processes, pardon the pun. So these are the right structures, the right organizational aspects that we need to own to actually get to this flexibility. And then the main word behind it, resilience. We need to understand that there are crises that do not actually give us the chance to do everything we can to avoid them, as we said with the metaphor of the immune system. And so we need to have good management. The staff should be on board in terms of trusting what we do, and in terms of actually getting the right communications about what we do. And then we need participatory systems so that they can actually understand what is going on. So we're talking about police departments, for example, for inspections. And then the flexibility, as we said. So our staff had to actually focus on something different, on medical emergencies. So how can we go about that as well? So how do we do that with the citizens? How do we do that from a structural or constructional viewpoint, with the design of plexical walls and so on and so forth? And then we had to make a decision. We know what our task is, but do we come up with specific teams? Do we work from home? Do we still stick around? So we needed to go beyond rigid rules to actually master the situation. Let's think about kindergartens when they were closed. Of course, people came to me, mainly women, asking, what do I do with my children? So we needed to reorganize everything to actually stay functional, so that we could keep on working whilst taking care of our children. So as we said, the possibility to have a system that can work. And so maybe we don't take into account everything that we did in the past, as our colleague said before. So as the president here in Mannheim, I took part at the study of the University of Heidelberg. This is a representation study with 20,000 interviewees in 5 regions, focused on the police. What were the stress factors, for example? To seek for a type of a new confirmation from a scientific viewpoint, so that we can always explain at best what we do, and we try to do that at an empirical level. And that is actually what I would like to see elsewhere, in other contexts, in other industries as well. So sometimes I do wonder, was what we did necessary? Did that entail a wrong assessment of the infection in terms of mutations and everything that went with it? So, for example, the lockdown at night time and so on and so forth. So that was quite hard to explain to the citizens, because we need to tell them, look, you cannot sit on a bench together anymore. So as a police officer, that was something quite new in terms of communication necessities inside and outside the police.
Well, back then we didn't know whether these decisions were right or wrong. Well, is it possible to build up a general type of resilience independently from what may happen? Well, let's say, well, if another pandemic breaks out, we as a society may be able to cope with that in a much better way. And the same applies to a financial crisis. So there may be a sort of immune response which is already active. But isn't it too dangerous? Because maybe we didn't have too much time to reflect upon. So again, can we build up a general type of resilience, or do we always have to focus on the individual circumstance? Well, I'd like first of all, to say something to what the previous speaker said. In the beginning, he said that what worked properly was flexibilization. Well, I have a slightly different perspective there, because this ad hoc flexibilization led to corporate cultures that were not fully aligned. And so we have to realize that corporate culture is of paramount importance. Many people join companies because they think their culture or their products are interesting. And as soon as an ad hoc flexibilization is implemented with specific models, culture lags behind and has to adapt. But resilience and culture are closely interconnected. They cannot be separated. There are people saying that, there is a very beautiful picture of people who didn't want to catch the train because this was not the speed they were used at. And I think this picture is very well in line with what happened. We had to adopt something we were not used at. There was a sort of culture shock, and we had to consider both the pros and cons of that situation. So we had to reflect upon these things. So we had to forget about older structures and adopt new structures. Going back to your question, well, general resilience within the framework of dams. So we are able to build dams. We can build them higher, but we cannot build dams that can protect us from any type of crises that may occur. So we can, of course, develop resilience against something that may have happened in the past and that we may have learned something about, but we still need to create a resilience capacity, a sort of buffer in terms of human resilience. Human resilience is very important. The staff, co-workers have to be developed so that reserves are there, financial reserves as well, so that they can be ready to cope with an emergency situation. And secondly, we need adaptability. I absolutely agree with Mr. Stenger. We have reached now the end of this flexibility in terms of hierarchy. We've had very good success results in terms of adaptation of the hierarchy, because as an authority, we are very good at defining flexible organization. And we are absolutely in line with economic enterprises because this type of organizational structure that we have implemented in authorities fulfills what is needed today. So considering that there are short intervals between one crisis and the next one, it is necessary to react quickly, to work in interdisciplinary teams, small teams that can make decisions in the short term. They allow themselves to make mistakes, to learn therefrom, and to develop themselves. So for this reason, we can also improve that feeling of acceptance and commitment. And this is a driver that is very impactful on co-workers and employees independently from their levels. So they must be able to contribute to the culture and to react regardless of the type of crisis that may break out. Well, when you go to conferences, congresses, or fairs, all people agree on the fact that we need permeable structures. We have to learn from mistakes. What about BASF? Well, I can imagine that there are companies in which learning by mistake is much easier. Well, in global companies, for example, with a lot of employees, this situation may become dangerous, quickly dangerous. But we also heard that it is important to build dams. And what is BASF doing in terms of building dams to protect itself from emergencies? Well, we as a chemical industry have constraints and rules that we necessarily have to abide by. And we've heard that we have products that may be dangerous not only for us as employees, but also for the general population. So trial errors are very important. We have to make sure that safety and security are guaranteed and risks are minimized. But in terms of corporate culture, this is very important. Well, I worked in very traditionally oriented companies, Volkswagen, for example, and their culture was not not very important. But, well, I absolutely agree with the fact that the pandemic has contributed a lot in changing the corporate culture. There were many large enterprises that didn't want to change the corporate culture, but, well, the scenario was not that good, but it led to a change in corporate culture in many companies. Error culture, and this is paramount for us as managers. We have to go the extra mile in order to do something. We cannot wait. We cannot expect from the lower levels that they implement the culture if we do not act first. And so talking about strengthening the dam, well, I think it is important that we, in the future, as we have to do with polycrisis and other phenomena, we all collaborate at the state, the industrial world, the population. We all have to intertwine our efforts. We all have interfaces. We cooperate closely together with state institutions, for example. Well, as my experience is concerned, every time authorities are approached, well, they are usually a bit reluctant and they tend to work in silence. But in the future, I think we have to network much more in order to foster resilience. And so who should lead in that case? So who could initiate that type of collaboration? Well, we already have such formats, and we have regular meetings with state authorities and representatives. We meet at least once a year to discuss specific topics. But I think the situation has improved. In March, for example, I still remember we had a blackout of 24 hours, and we had just met the people from the municipality, and we talked about this topic. And so we said, well, what about this topic? Well, I think we are very well structured. And then finally a blackout broke out, and so we realized that there may be some dynamics that had to be improved, especially in jointly managing these situations. Mr. Stenger, you said hierarchical systems can hardly be changed. And so in my idea, the Criminal Investigation Office is very strictly structured. So what should happen in order to obtain a permeability in such strictly hierarchies? Well, we have to work on the principles. And, well, by the way, the Criminal Investigation Office is not a traditional system with the classical structure of such an institution, because the situation is so complicated that in order to organize our work, we always need multidisciplinary teams. Well, of course, we tend to be associated with crime scenes, but this is no longer the case. Digitalization is important, and so we need the right amount of time and the right amount of resources in order to organize our work. And organization is paramount, and I want to underline what the previous speaker said. We have to extend this approach as much as possible. The mayor, for example, has access to the resources, and so they have to implement the right players who are able to manage crisis situations. A lot of studies were conducted about the lessons learned from the pandemic period, and so whenever we had problems in terms of resources, we developed specific instruments to try and save as much money as possible. But now crime is a transnational phenomenon, and with digitalization, you need different experts, and this means you need to organize them yourself, and you need to develop a specific organization. The flexibility or the elasticity, at least in your mind, this readiness to change yourself and to approach tasks together and jointly is an integral part of the corporate culture. Our claim on which we worked so hard focuses on security, on safety, and this implies that people have to go beyond the borders of one's own organization, LKA, for example, in order to work in an interdisciplinary way. If you just focus on the quantitative number, well, in terms of numbers, we are overwhelmed by cases, and security authorities and safety authorities can hardly react properly. We can do so if we cooperate in terms of investigations, for example. In Baden-Württemberg, for example, we have a very good and successful cooperation. We can meet very quickly, and beyond the borders of the individual institution, we are able to work in a over regional level if the phenomenon, if the event is an intra-regional phenomenon. Because, you know, today there are many complications that have to be taken into account, data protection, for example, and many other functional aspects that have to be overcome. But in terms of communication, of transparency, and of development of a mindset and trust, we've made a lot of progress. During the pandemic, we carried out a lot of onboarding sessions in order to obtain the right specialists, especially in IT, in a period of high competition. If you read some studies about talents, well, you can see that highly talented specialists go to specific companies because of the popularity or because of the diversification of the tasks, and they leave companies if they're not happy with their managers. So considering that now everything is becoming faster and faster, everyone has to be ready to change and to adapt. A lot has been requested, and there are a lot of fears. Fear of losing one's own routine, and fear of not being up to the new task. There are many people who try to compensate that with some reluctance or other attitudes. So it is up to the managers to cope with that. You said popularity, renommee of companies is very important. Mr. Kurz, the employer, the state as an employer. Well, I think corporate culture and the promotion of change is important also for a state. Well, in a state, there are specific departments, changes in the management structure. What about the situation in a state institution? Well, it's absolutely a key issue. And it's the issue number one, which is a permanent issue to be taken into account. Well, of course, it's not easy, but it's a permanent task because you always have the trend, the tendency to go back to old structures. But in terms of employers' culture, the corporate culture is very important too, because it impacts on the perception. And well, if you have organizational change in public service, it can be difficult then to implement. Because, well, we changed our organization, for example. In the beginning, it was very difficult. And, well, again, the culture issue continues to remain a hot topic because there are always new approaches that are needed. Key in this process is the leadership. So leadership is very important, although at a community level, at the communal level, it is not yet on the agenda. Well, of course, we have 220 different products, and if you do not have a culture, you can hardly be successful. Well, you know, if you put the fire brigades and the youth office together, they can hardly communicate because they do not share the same culture. So we cannot say we have an individual culture, but we certainly have some points of contact. But again, the topic of leadership is very important for promoting resilience in a company. And this is a sector that has always been very static. It's static because it is extremely difficult to have changes in the leadership level, for example, when someone is promoted. So we should work with potential analysis. But as we heard, we have 70% of good decisions and 30% of wrong decisions. Again, in public services, we have a different situation, and in the public service we do not have potential analysis as it is the case for companies. But again, communication, mistake, error culture, and these are all aspects that must be experienced on a daily basis through experience. If a manager, a leader, doesn't lead by example, employees cannot follow. We no longer have to stick to hierarchies. They are obsolete. They have to lead by example. And so we are trying to focus on various initiatives in order to promote that type of culture, to provide support. In other words, I would say it's a central issue, a key issue, as I said multiple times, but you should formulate a clear requirement that should be the subject of political decisions. And these decisions should apply both to the managers and to the employees. You cannot have two parallel strategies. And the same applies to the requirement of resilience. However, I do not see a lot of debate on that. Okay, the only thing I got is the word leadership. So what are the requirements of managers and leaders? So how can managers and leaders navigate through the VUCA era? Well, they should be progressive, transparent, analytical. But there's an acronym from science. So they must be goal-oriented. They must be led by emotions, ready to improvise. They must be able to convince, and they must be empathetic. So this can have a positive influence, especially when managers are more resilient than employees. So I mean, managers must lead by example and must be more resilient. What about you? Yes, I want to go back to what we said yesterday, ambiguity tolerance. So they must be able to tackle ambiguous situations, as it is usually the case in our society, because well, what happens outside of our organization is usually mirrored in one's own organization. So in large organizations, you see what actually happens in the larger society. And for this reason, you have to be able to cope with things that are not 100% clear. Although, because we have to deal with things that do not lead us to develop a higher resilience. And so we must be able to make decisions also in periods of clarity. But what I like of companies and leadership is the development of resilience skills. What should employees know in order to be able to act properly, both in teams and individually? On the one hand, you need feedback. So through feedback, reactions, through information, you can increase the transparency of communication. So giving and getting feedback, then improvisation and tolerance vis-a-vis ambiguity and clarity. And these are all skills that are very important. But all this works only if employees feel safe, so they can act that way if the surrounding conditions, for example, the workplace, well, as far as civil servants are concerned, this has a relative importance, but for many other companies, it's really paramount. So as soon as the general conditions are clear, you can do a lot in terms of how to cope with uncertainties. For example, the management of mistakes and errors. Because well, you can focus on personal mistakes, or you can also say that every single mistake can make a company stronger. There are HROs, for example, BASF, which define very clear rules and regulations. For example, nuclear power plants. If a mistake occurs, the individual people are not punished, but rather praised. That is, so how could this gap be found out in the system? So good that it was found out, so that we can fix it. And it's not the individual misbehavior which is punished, but rather the consequences of it are praised. And this is, in my opinion, the best conditions to get ready for a certain crisis. So both from the side of the managers and from organizations, we should have this focus in order to get ready. And this is particularly important for the HR department. So if you want to hire a new person, what are the skills that are very important? Because in the past, generalists could be more relevant than specialists, but now it seems to be the other way around. I think we should not generalize. Because those who are flexible and can work very well in teams because they are used at coping with different perspectives and solving problems. Well, all this is important, but the situation has changed so dramatically from the baby boomers to the new generations. If I look back at 50 years of police history, well, these changes play a very important role because, well, the attitude has changed, and this stresses the management a lot. We've learned a lot from crisis, and then, well, the good balance between professional and private life. Well, we've learned a lot in this respect. Cooperation too. Well, in the past, well, we had to allow first one to work, and then you could follow up. And now with digitalization, everything has become much quicker and much more efficient. So for sure, there are new opportunities that were used and that are now useful to tackle new situations. But I think we have to make managers fit because, well, as I usually say, we need people who are able to say stop if needed. So in other words, they need to be able to guide the processes, and at the same time, they must be able to create a good climate, providing at the same time guidance and clarity in the language they use. This is partly difficult because it's a process that must be learned, because as we heard, we have 30% potential, which is still untapped in this respect, and this has to do with leadership as well. So the leadership 4.0, what do we expect from the managers? I think this has to be properly communicated, and also the emotional bond, so credibility, the emotional bonding vis-à-vis companies and authorities has ups and downs and fluctuates. Well, in particular in LKA is very visible. And I think, well, for civil servants, it's very difficult to reach all this and to acquire all these skills. Well, you know, it's quite usual that we have people who join our institution, they grow, and then they leave our company again. And this is actually good, although the perception is very bad, because, you know, if we train a person in terms of cybercrime and after 2 years he leaves and goes to BASF, well, of course, this is very bad, but we need to be prepared for this.
So in the past, potential candidates could be maybe engage in a different way, and they could stay attracted to us, which is obviously not today the case anymore. How can we work a bit more in a bit more flexible way? Can I have a home office abroad? So this emotional bond is difficult to support. As we said, agility, people can work everywhere. So obviously that's fine if you work for Siemens or Volkswagen, and the different parameters of the between your work-life balance elements, of course, have changed, and in our case as well, because we have seen change at a societal level. So there are areas that cannot be transferred to a home office when manufacturing, for example. So that needs to be done in the place where the manufacturing is supposed to be happening. Then you have other people who work in an absolutely flexible way without actually causing disruptions in the team. So that's something which is difficult to conjugate, maybe. So is this a chance? Is this an opportunity for younger generations, from considering this from a viewpoint of resilience? So my private, personal resilience is important to me. Is this positive for a company, or is this a big risk because this emotional bond to the company gets lost along those fluctuations? So how can we make this more stable? So, so actually, when I think back to my family, they all worked 30 years for the same company, and that was a kind of bond at workload level. So I believe that things are way different now. So there are people who actually are scared, however, when they start thinking about working in a more agile way, because they fear they will be losing out in terms of controlling the situation, or maybe not performing well enough. So I would say that this is difficult, of course, to lose out on staff that is trained, and then you have to go and recruit somebody new from scratch. And then, in spite of all of that, nevertheless, the positive components are great. So those fluctuations do offer new possibilities. We need such flexibility. A flexibility that can put together quite a few things. So I believe that this is actually better than actually dragging along through the years with the same old routine. But we need to be able to manage. This is a totally different type of requirement. So there are elements that can be gauged, as we said. Then we can actually acknowledge the fact that in a home office, sometimes the performance of a worker is actually better and the output is better. So we need to take that into account. So the culture needs to be changed from that viewpoint. And then this also creates a whole degree of satisfaction as long as the limits and the rules are clearly communicated, so that we can actually match the expectations in a much clearer way. So in general, I believe that this is fine. It creates a more lively working environment, but of course this is difficult for the managers, and at the police, in the police structure, it's actually the same situation. Well, fluctuation is not a negative factor by itself. So, so you talked about a fluctuation in terms of know-how as well. So this is something that impacts the management of an organization. Think about the onboarding. So this costs a lot of energy, for example, when you need to onboard people, to take people on board, better said. So for leaders, this is important. So first of all, you need to recognize the staff, because they do not feel that they shouldn't feel like they are gatekeepers for that type of knowledge, that type of know-how that they have, and then they can get rid of easily when somebody else comes and can take their place. So recognition. And then we need to think about the framework conditions, so to speak, at a professional and a personal level. What happens is this know-how documented? Is that accessible somehow for people who will come later on? So from an organizational viewpoint, this is an important factor that pertains to the managers, and the managers need to create such open and transparent structures. So fluctuation is something that we need to talk about, and that needs to be tackled, as we said, USP, as we mentioned before. So the performance is actually not badly impacted by fluctuations and by such flexibility. And the aspect of the security or safety of any admin work when we talk about public administration. Uh, so actually, we need to rethink all those elements as well. So what's the expectation of the staff? Do they expect to stay here for 30 years? Or do they expect to be integrated into the organization from a personal viewpoint as well, which is good. So they understand better the organization overall. So they developed a certain plasticity, which obviously gives way to more resilience over the long run. So integrating people and recreating, helping reshaping the same system. So we need to think anew, for example, and explain things all over again. And sometimes you notice that topics just die out over time. So actually, given the chance to restructure and reshape organization, this is positively connotated. Actually, over the past few years, we needed to do exactly this due to change in the overall situation. So more fluctuations within the organization, as we said. So So per year, we needed to find more staff, as we've noticed over time. So, and where do we find them? Inside the organization, outside the organization, and obviously that was something that needed to be rethought time and again whenever a position became available. So, as we said, we need more inputs from the outside, and this slows the whole system down. And this is obviously connected to a number of reasons, which I will not touch upon here. But the fluctuation that we talked about, the flexibility, the agility per se, can actually strengthen us. That's something which is required So this is also connected to a number of dimensions that have changed. So more attention paid to ourselves. This is obviously one of the positive sides of this new context. So a more transparent relationship to our employers as well. So when we talk about this bond that you mentioned and the responsibilities which are connected to the job itself, so do I have an opportunity within the opportunity when I become an integrated part of such a company or such organization? So for the newer generations, we want to stay interesting and attractive. So there are quite a few dimensions that need to be taken into account. So this is our motto, if you will, to create an offer that can be attractive, that can be interesting, and we need to be motivators in a way. And it was clear to see during the crisis, during the pandemic, that there was a clear difference between people who could motivate their staff and those who couldn't. And those people who did not feel motivated felt like they were left on their own. So during the pandemic, that was of particular importance because we could not hold on to the regular contacts that we used to have in the past. And those situations maybe were perceived in a different way in other organizations. And there were different processes that came into play and that they were decisive in a way. So I believe that we had those two different attitudes. On the one hand, people who felt engaged, and on the other hand, people who felt they were like they had been left on their own. However, this could be a positive story when considering this topic of big organizations. So in a big team, we can see both developments, which is obviously interesting when we try and identify the positive elements of projects, of collaborations, for example. How does that impact our everyday life? So the both sides of the coin, if you will. And of course, either way had its price. So we are slowly approaching the end of this session. Resilience, this is not something random. It needs to be fostered in and stimulated in a proactive way. So we need people. We, in terms of staff, we need good managers. And so is this something that we can that can be learned over time, or does uh, it have to do more with the character, with everybody's personality? Well, empathy. Empathy, of course, can be tested somehow, as we can read in literature, but this is obviously an element which is human oriented. So there is a huge predisposition if you lead, if you will. So in terms of controlling your impulses and reacting to somebody else's behavior, but maybe we can also connect that to authenticity. Is this authentic, Or is this something which is displayed by managers who actually learned such skills and do not come across as authentic? So let's say authenticity, as you said, connected to good corporate culture, resources that need to be readily available to tackle and stimulate such areas in a proactive way. So, are there questions from the audience? Please do raise your hand. In the meantime, I will ask one last question. Yeah, you need more time. Okay, fine. Uh, so, we have understood that in the future things will keep on evolving, so we need to take into account the possibility of other outbreaks and other crises, so we need to be prepared. So what would be the main topic that you would focus on in your organization? Or maybe is there anything that you want to change after discussing with the panelists? Well, for us, the dynamics of changes in the context in which we work. So the digital access to all the documents, for example, so the fact that we do not have to stick anymore to the crime scene, for example, because we can exchange pieces of information, we can be active in a more agile way, as we said, and then this is clear when considering the um, crimes connected to cybercrime, so IT, and so on and so forth. And this is always connected to the economic situations, as we said, and this leads us to an international level. So the internationality, if you will, of the data generated at a worldwide level that need to be processed by our own systems that sometimes are a bit obsolete. So obviously you cannot gauge everything, you cannot acknowledge everything per hand. So those changes impact us, and they do require what is actually supported by resilience throughout crises. So elasticity, agility. So we need investigators, for example, who can be active all over the world thanks to those technical tools. So we need to be able to come up with teams that can rely upon different skills. So yeah, so there is a managerial aspect to it at an organizational level. So uh, we need to create a bigger, more elastic organization, already including smaller departments that used to work in silos, so without losing out on the quality that we can already base our work upon. So we need to be strongly oriented towards our staff and fellow uh, colleagues, not in a static way, but as we said, we can readjust as time goes by. And this has to do with such an administration office as ours. This has to do with the region, a region such as Baden-Württemberg, the whole federal level and the international level. So when we talk about cyber specialists, for example, in Esslingen, so ransom tech, ransomware groups, for example. This has to do with the blackmailing threats. Of course, we need to have the right structures in place so that we can react directly. So, crime prevention and crime control, that is our main task. But then at times of crisis, we've talked about that time and again, we need to be resilient and agile. So this is a lifelong learning principle connected to our structures with which we have to work. So we need to be able to weather in a dynamic way such changes without actually being part of a rigid bureaucratic office and apparatus, if you will. So also including all those who wish to contribute on a voluntary basis. So we talked about cybercrime, and then to the answer that I asked in the very beginning, your answer would be yes. No, that's actually just a joke. So long and complex is the way to our goal. And yes, as we said, we need to tackle new crime formats and natural catastrophes. So from a qualitative and quantitative viewpoint, we need to manage that in a better way. So at times of a vacuum from a security and safety viewpoint, well, that's important. Let's go back to the pandemic. When we had to face the coronavirus injections, of course, we had to come up with for example, all the passes and the vaccination certificates that then were then issued by us, but we also saw that they were falsified. So, yet again, how will things further develop? Can we actually be prepared to such scenarios? How can we work at an interdisciplinary level together to create such a network? All right, let's continue with Dr. Kurz and Maaß-Emden. So from a practical and from a scientific viewpoint, so the challenges that the city will have to face, we believe. Thank you. So we are already facing a new crisis, and probably we are not adequately prepared when we think about climate change. Again, resilience. And this is a question that hasn't been answered in an adequate way yet. So there is a superstructure, if you will, when we consider the stability of the positions that we had or the perspectives that we had in the past. We live at times of big changes and at a number of levels, social upheavals, disruptions. So can we actually address such issues in a correct way without actually splitting up our society? So without single people splintering away, if you will, from the society overall in which we live. Society in which we live. So again, can we identify possible consequences that will not become manifest in a random way? So facing a crisis, and what are the presuppositions to actually draw a lesson from one viewpoint and be prepared for the next. On the other hand, probably I haven't fully answered your question. However, the issue is relevant for us all. We're all trying to come up with an answer, and a part of such answer, in my opinion, is the lessons drawn from the pandemic: more communication, more transparency in our networks. We have resources that we maybe have underestimated so far, and then the skills and the capacities that we have, and then the European Green Deal. How can that be put into practice at a local level, and how can we identify the right staff to work with? So a local green deal, not just for the city itself, but for the society overall as citizens. Then citizenship and citizens in general, how do they contribute? How can they contribute to the city, to the organization, and then to the support of such networks? All this is part of the job of such teams. This is another aspect of public administration. When this works fine and we are fully convinced that we do rely upon those networks, then we can move on to different questions connected to a crisis. So we can consider different situations. For example, think about the US. Uh, this is something which is difficult to uphold. And we have heard time and again the examples drawn from the healthcare sector. So are we ready to face such situations from a society viewpoint? Can we answer? Can we react to that in a correct way? Are we well equipped? I'm not sure, but what I can say is that we are trying. We have been trying all the way. And in the national and international networks, we have a common vision, for example, climate neutrality, for example, for all the cities. But what does that mean in a more concrete way? We can formulate whatever ambitions we want, but they need to be translated into practical programs. And we have taken upon ourselves to actually engage over the last few years to be fully prepared and come up with answers to those big challenges. So, yeah, of course, Dr. Maaß-Emden. So, as a counselor, as a consultant, what is your take on this? So I'll go back to the topics that we have already mentioned. So there are elements which are omnipresent. Of course, we do not have a magic wand to actually foresee what will happen in the future, a crystal ball. So the further developments on the financial markets, for example, so this is something to be taken into account. OPEX, for example, we are talking about corporate elements, for example. So this is the beginning of a process of clearing up, if you will. What do we need? Who do we need? Who will generate turnover right now and in the future? And this is probably a perspective that will still have an impact, because the different topics will not disappear over time, and we need to understand which companies can actually focus on their core business so that they can stay financially viable. So what are the expense items, for example? What products and services do they need to concentrate on? So this is a crisis that probably we are managing in too easy of a way, but we will see a direct impact, as we have already observed when considered, for example, the increase of the energy prices. And then there are also positive aspects. So this willingness, this openness, uh, willingness to change, this is tangible because many understand that they can't go on this way. So they need to change something. And this would be my last point. So that would actually be a positive take-home message. Is there any question from the audience? No, thank you very much. Thank you very much to all our panelists, Dr. Peter Kurz, Jan Philipp Maaß-Emden, Andreas Stenger and Julia Vincke.